are seagulls on Bain Lake. There's so much water right now on top of it. They're probably wondering, what the heck?
My great-grandfather and Tamara's great-grandfather, brothers, they came from Scotland back in around 1880. According to information that I can find. They came with a half-sister as well. She married a Delandrias in the area. So we descend from them. Tamara still lives on her great-grandfather's property. She owns that. And I also own my great-grandfather's property. So it's still in the family name. And my grandfather, which was the oldest child of my great-grandfather, he homesteaded the farm beside his father, so I own both of them. So they're still in the family, which is very nice, and it's right beside Tamara's. So it just very fortuitous. So we didn't have to move; it was just like across the road type of thing.
And were they farmed? Were they like what state are they in from what they were in 140 years ago?
My mother always told me that my great-grandfather came to this plot of land and he stood on the north shore and declared that he'd spend the rest of his days there, and so he did. He farmed. He had declared a homestead, and he farmed. He had his brother's help, and together they worked and cleared the land enough to officially make it an official homestead for the government, and built a small house below where our barn is now. The barn has a date carved into the peak of 1898, but he acquired the homestead in 1880. The farmhouse that my daughter lives in now, my mother just passed away last year, and my daughter lives in there with the 6th generation of our family. And we did some renovations to that farmhouse last year in preparation of her moving in. And we had to expose the original peaks of the roof. So the house was built in 2 stages. 3 stages actually. There was the first part with the just a plain Jane house, and then they built an addition, and then they built another addition. And when we exposed the old roof, there was still the shingles in there, and the shingles were practically brand new. So it tells us that perhaps the house was added on to fairly quickly as the family grew.
How many children did they have?
7, okay.
And number 6 was Ed.
Yes, 6.
Which is your grandfather,
yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Yes, there's a tragic story with my grandfather. He and my grandmother, May Brooks, from Spring Creek, back in Spring Creek, further from where we are right now. They, of course, were somewhat neighbors and married late, in their late 20s. Had my mother, Beverly, in 1935, and for whatever reason my grandmother chose to have Beverly in Toronto, and my grandfather would travel the train back and forth to see his brand new family. At some point he contracted strep throat, and my great-grandfather was quite elderly at that point, couldn't help him, thought that perhaps he would get help at the hospital where his wife and child were, put him on the train in, I believe, Truck Creek, and he died en route. So my grandmother had she was a new widow with a new 6-week-old baby. The baby was 6 weeks. She was in Toronto for an extended period of time because she contracted childbed fever. And that's why she was there for so long. She came home with her dead husband and her baby. She arranged for care for her baby, buried her husband, went back to continue convalescing in the hospital in Toronto, and then came back and bought the farm from my great-grandfather, James R. Bain, for $1, with the speculation that she never marry again, so that the farm remained in the Bain name,
Oh my goodness.
and she did not.
Wow.
So my mother never knew her father. We never knew our grandfather. May and her baby daughter made a pretty good go of the farm with hired hands and the help of her brothers. Her brothers were just, 10 miles back into Spring Creek.
Yeah, it was 3 or 4 miles. Yeah.
So it was a family affair. And before my grandfather passed away, he had begun developing a tourist camp on the lake, and he built 2 cottages across the lake. And
What year would they have started that tourist business?
he died in 1935. So I want to say 1930.
Ish. Yeah.
Between 30 and 35.
Okay.
With the 2 cottages across the lake. Primarily Americans would be the guests. So then eventually my grandmother expanded on the camp. After the Second World War, she had her brothers build 2 more cabins and a larger cabin. Jeepers, I can't remember who built that. I had this information.
Yeah, somebody from the valley built it.
Yes.
Can't remember the name. Yeah.
My grandmother had a small log cabin built at the end of our laneway as a hunt camp. Eventually that was moved to the main part of the camp. The 2 cottages across the lake, one was moved over in the early 70s across the ice. And my mother tells me that they had a bulldozer pulling it in the wintertime, and they wanted to pull it closer to the lake, but that where it sits is where they got it to. And
It hasn't moved.
and it didn't move.
Love it.
so-
And is it still being rented?
Yes.
Yes.
That's fantastic.
My father built a cottage in the late 70s. And then my great aunt had a house on the property that she had an arrangement with my grandmother to live in as long as she lived. And once she passed away, it was moved over to the main part of the camp as well. So there are 7 rentals on the
That
on
is
the
a,
lake.
a full family story.
Yes.
Every building, every story. That's fantastic. So your grandmother, as a widow, farmed and then went on to run a camp, correct?
I believe she did both at the same time.
Both at the same time.
Because the
Yeah.
cottages
Okay.
were established before Ed passed away. So
And the farm was still up until 10 years ago. You
Yes.
still had cattle. So
Oh, okay.
they did a lot of crop farming when my great-grandfather cleared the land. They won awards for their peas. They grew peas for cattle feed. And
at the Royal Winter Fair.
yes, the Royal Winter Fair, they
Yes.
won awards.
In this soil, imagine.
Yes,
I
I
know.
know.
Isn't that something?
Wow.
A good, hardworking Scotsman.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes, and they had horses, the work horses, in the wintertime. My mother tells me that it was quite a chore for her and my grandmother May to go down to the lake to get water for the cattle and the horses in the wintertime and haul it up by horse.
There was
and a
no
sleigh.
pump. There was,
No,
Wow.
they had to get it. There was this would have been the
Before the hydro come into the area. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Wow.
Well, my grandmother died in her early 80s, and as her only heir, my mother Beverly, took over the camp. Unfortunately, she and her husband, my dad Howard, only had about just a few years before he also had died with cancer. And so things became in a state of disrepair. And 5 years ago, with Larry's help, I worked up enough courage to ask my mother if I could take over the camp.
So, what do you see happening in the future? Where do you see your family farms going?
Well, all 3 of my children have property on the original homestead, and so hopefully that's a good sign that they're going to stick around into the future. I have 5 grandchildren, and they all live on the property, of course. My daughter will be the 3rd generation woman to run Bain Lake Camp whenever I retire,
Fantastic.
which is, my grandmother was a woman far beyond her time. Stubborn gets you a long way. And she didn't have a choice. She had to be tough, and she's passed that backbone down to us. And I hope that the land is continuing on into the future as far as the future goes.
Well, this is home. It's always been home. I've left the area I went to college for 3 years, so most of the year I wasn't here. I come back for summer every year for summer job and to help on the farm. Because being the only boy, I got 3 sisters. I was the only son, and so came back, made sure there was help on the farm for the haying and everything like that. Then I left for 2 years. I was in Calgary for about 2.5 years, and that's when I ended up. Always figured I'd come back to the farm someday. Then I got a phone call, and Mom says, Dad's going to get rid of the cattle unless you come back. Do you want to take over the farm? I'll be right back.
So the connection was strong enough
Yep.
that you didn't even hesitate.
No. That was a given. I just didn't have a date in my head.
Right.
Yeah.
And
So-
Tamara, obviously you never have, with that history with your grandmother and mother and...
I lived off the farm for a time, just not any more than 10 miles away. And in a roundabout way, in a great big giant circle, about 20 years later, I ended back on the farm, and you'll have to carry me off to get me off again, as my mother and her mother did.
That's
At
fantastic.
the same way, yes.
Yeah.